Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Perpetual Chess. Listeners, we are going to catch up with a guest I have not chatted with since June 2018, and he's actually a favorite guest, so I'm excited to bring him back in. But first, wanted to give a shout out to our presenting chess education sponsors, Chessable.com. Our guest, in fact, after all these years, an accomplished grandmaster, has finally written his first Chessable course. It's called Beginner Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. We will be digging into that course, among other things, but of course, they also have a wide variety of opening, middle game and end game courses that you can check out. And if you sign up for Chessable Pro, be sure to use the link in the show notes to help support Perpetual Chess. So as for our guest, he is a state champion of 3 different states. I forgot to ask him how many for each state before we recorded, but a bunch of state championships is all you really
wouldn't know.
Okay. And he's also been a Scholastic National Champion. He's a writer and a trainer. And as we said, now a Chessable author. And I'm excited to welcome back to the program, Grandmaster Josh Friedel. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to catch up after all this time. So
yeah,
you finally
I didn't know it was that long.
Yeah, I know, right? We're getting old.
I was like, he doesn't like me anymore. It's fine. It's no big deal.
So what was the impetus for your first Chessable course, Josh?
Well, a lot of it because I started writing a book, a year or two ago, but not as seriously until last year, I would say. And I was talking to Jesse Cry, and he was suggested, yeah, you should, dude, of course he has to, and you should probably try to put some of it on Chessable, do this. So I'm like, all right, so he put me in touch with someone, and it was very clear that wasn't going to work, but I was still they're like, if you want to do a video series or something, we'd be happy to do something. So they ask, what did I want to do it on? And you have to realize, I've probably made videos on almost everything at this point. I haven't made as many as people who make them online all the time. I'm not putting myself in that category, but I've been doing video courses for 4 or 5 different websites since I was in my teens. So it's kind of I've done everything. Just what do you need is more the important thing. So they wanted beginner content. So we tossed some ideas around, and they really liked the idea, which I actually also was one of the ideas I liked better, which was the choice between the 2 options thing. And that's kind of how it came about.
Yeah, so the course is called Beginner Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. And Josh, I was impressed because obviously Chessable has a large roster of course creators, some more strong amateur level, and then grandmasters like yourself. And the rap on grandmasters is that they're not great beginner teachers, but that doesn't apply to you. Your course is very clearly presented. What differentiates you in that regard?
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm sure there are others who also teach beginners quite well. I think that a big part of it is the separation. So a comparison I would make is that, let's say you're learning a language, right? And you want to talk to native speakers, right? Let's pretend GMs are the native speakers who just know everything backwards and forwards. It's great, right? You talk to them and it's good. But if you ask them, why is it this way? A lot of the time they're like, I don't know, this is right. You know what I mean? And I don't want to mean, it doesn't imply that GMs don't know the explanations to things, but a lot of the times things are just so automatic, right? When I look at a position and see certain things or whatever, I don't, for me, it happens. It's not something that I have to then consciously think about. And it makes it very challenging sometimes to teach and present to beginners because it's such a different perspective. But one of the things so I took a break from playing tournaments for a while. And so I pursued different things. One of the things I pursued was I always loved music, and I've been learning guitar for the last 5-6 years, right? So I got to be a beginner at something, which is cool. And one thing I learned was that, how cool it was to, learn things for the first time, but that things have to be very simple. Even just playing a C chord is hard when you haven't done it. You don't know how to press a string and do things. So it gave me an appreciation for, again, for what it was like, because I was a beginner at one point. So it helped me sort of connect to what it's like, and being able to go, okay, you break things down very basically and try to make it so that, I'm not just assuming they see a 2-move tactic, right? You have to say, talk about all right, this is what's happening. This is the important things in the position. Choose between 2 options, right? Which is much easier than you have a board full of pieces and what am I going to do? I don't know. I could bring this out. I could bring this out. When you focus on something, you're trying to look for pieces that are covered. These are your 2 choices. You have to either not hang something or take a piece. It becomes a little simpler because when you're starting, the board is just, this mess. But when you become really advanced, you don't think about that. I just see a board with a bunch of pieces attacked and okay, whatever, right? So separating that and trying to go back to how I viewed it then is a big part of that for me. Because it's a different perspective. Like, you don't think about it consciously, right? Like if you're speaking English, right, we're not thinking about syntax and grammar at all, right? We're just speaking. So
yeah, and it's especially impressive for you because most grandmasters started early, but you started at 3. Like, you started earlier.
Yeah, so I don't remember too much when I was a beginner. That's very true. But I'm sure, like, I went through the beginner phase probably longer because I was like young and probably didn't have the attention span of someone learning later, right? I was told I was a very boring child with a good attention span, but even so, it's not. Again, like, learning something new for me, right, is also, or pursuing a language or something, like it gives you a perspective because everything is hard, right? Everything is not easy, and it's very helpful to kind of be the person, because like I was saying with the language thing, you talk to someone who also had to learn the hard way, it can be more helpful because they know what you have to go through. They don't just do it automatically, right?
Yeah. And as you said, I do really like the idea of breaking it down into 2 choices for each move. It does make it much more manageable. So did you had that idea in mind from the beginning of the course?
It was one of several ideas I presented to them because, like I've said, I've kind of done a lot. So it's sort of, but that's one idea which I like in general when teaching beginners. And so it was something I presented and they liked. That was the idea that they liked. And so we kind of went with that. It was a collaborative thing a little bit, right? Because they, I have my ideas, but I also am aware that they have numbers and what people like and more than I do, right? So I also want to collaborate with them. So it's not just my ideas, right? It's their ideas, but then I make the material and design the course and things like that.
Okay. And for finding the material for this course, you went through a bunch of chess.com beginner games.
Yep.
Like, what struck you as you did that?
Well, what struck me is I wasn't as fully aware of what a beginner was as I thought I was what first happened, because I've taught beginners, but I would say I've taught beginners who aren't quite at the beginner level that they're talking yet. Like, the beginners I've taught are like, they put pieces in the center, they castle kind of thing.
Yeah.
And in most of those games, that did not happen. So it kind of took me by surprise. But at the same time, I also had to remember that a lot of those games are blitz games or rapid games. Like, the idea of beginners playing blitz is almost horrifying to me because it's like, it's so hard to play a chess game when you're a beginner. Never mind, like, just play a legal chess game where you don't try to hang anything playing slow, right? The idea of a beginner playing blitz, it's like, okay, like, it's cool, but you're not learning much. You're just basically making random moves. So it felt kind of hard, but I tried to choose examples which I saw a bunch, right? Like, obviously, like, putting a piece on a square can be captured, or not taking an opponent's piece when it's on a square that is captured is a very clear thing that beginners have to learn. But apart from that, it was just, I tried to lock on to, like, the more common patterns that I saw and try to make it do an example where almost for sure they've seen something exactly like that. Not an example where it's like, well, here you could have trapped a bishop on the side of the board and didn't, but this pattern never happens. And, I try to stay away from that kind of thing.
And I don't know how much of the course you want to give away, but it's one thing to identify them. It's another thing to learn how to avoid them, as the second half of your course title suggests. So what did you determine? Like, how do you figure out how to avoid them, again, coming from a grandmaster perspective?
A lot of it is building board awareness. So what that means is that you want to be aware of everything that's attacked and you want to attack on a board, and you want to be in the habit of doing this all the time. And that's one of the reasons why when I see all these beginner blitz games, I'm kind of shuddering to myself, because you don't have time to do that. And what that means is you're not getting in the habit of doing it. A lot of it is about habit. If you get used to, every time you look at a chess position, you look at what's being attacked and what they're attacking, eventually it just becomes second nature. You don't have to think about it. You can tell me this too, right? Like, you're not always, you have to think about it sometimes, but you automatically will see if a queen's attacked, probably, right?
Right.
And it doesn't mean you're not looking, but you get in the habit of looking all the time, and that's how it becomes automatic. And I think that for a lot of people, because of how they interact with chess, they don't build that as a habit, and then it makes it harder to progress and harder to see. And that's just like the very basic thing, right? But it makes it hard to practice anything, right?
And I know, Josh, you've been teaching chess for decades, and as you say, I've presented courses for a wide array of audiences. But do you have beginner students these days?
I do. I have not beginner, but I have students who I actually this week actually taught a first time student who's 70 years old and is picking up the game for the first time in 50 years, basically. So
wow,
not beginner,
cool.
but sort of towards that range.
Okay.
And I have taught people who are pretty low rated, but I don't generally speaking, beginner students wouldn't go to me, which makes sense, right? But I have taught and do teach some beginners.
Okay.
So I would say most of my students, at least now, are in the, I would say 1600 to 2100 range is very common for me. I used to have a higher student range. I would say I used to teach more titled players than I currently do. But I have taught pretty much, but I would say that intermediate range is much more common, but I have taught beginners for sure.
And as you get to that intermediate range, Josh, what are the most common mistakes you see at that level, 1600 to 2100?
A lot of my lessons are I repeat some things a lot. So I'm sure my students get a little bit sick of it. But one of the most common intermediate mistakes I see is how they calculate. And it's actually, this is a mistake that goes up the chain too, because a lot of the times 2200s will have a similar problem at a higher level than 1600s will. And what that is they're just not considering enough options. When they're calculating, all their variations look like sticks. It's boom, 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 boom. There's no tree, right? A variation here, they can play both captures. And quite often, they're not making a mistake on move 6. They're making a mistake on move 2 because they're not considering a move. And I'd say that's one of the most common mistakes I see at a lot of levels between even 1300 to 2300. It's a similar version. Obviously, a 2300 will make different mistakes, but it's the same thing. And it's something I notice, even when I analyze with players who are my level or stronger, what I notice about really strong players is they're considering more options a lot of the time. It's just a big part of it. So just getting to forcing yourself to not on move 2, if they have 3 captures, you look at 3 captures. You don't look at just the one move that's in your head, and maybe will be right, but maybe won't be. And that's a huge one for intermediate players, I would say.
I'm certainly guilty. Yeah.
You're not alone.
It's weird because it's it's one of those things where 8 out of 10 times, 9 out of 10 times, you're okay. But then that one move that you forgot to look more widely can really bite you.
But you have to think about this. 8 out of 9, first of all, 9 out of 10 is very generous, I would say. But let's even pretend it's 9 out of 10. That's one decision. How many of those decisions are you making in a game? How many of those lines are you calculating in a game? How many mistakes does that add up to? And chess is an unforgiving game. You only need one.
Yeah.
Right? So, but if you're, and it's not I'm telling you that you're not going to make mistakes when you consider more moves, but so often a variation can be just discarded because just an alternative on move 2, you don't have to waste time thinking about it. And it becomes such a common thing that, because I have some students who are, younger and improving players, right? And they can calculate blindingly fast. But even with them, half the time they calculate a 6-move line in a few seconds. So I'm all right, that's cool. But on move 2, every time, and it's always kind of fun though, because they know, but it's really hard to actually force yourself to do it. It's a lot of discipline.
So in your lessons, are you often kind of just slowing down? And it makes me think of what you said about learning guitar, slowing down and sort of just going through it together.
Yeah. Well, I would have this, my guitar teacher, I'd be trying to play something, they'd be okay, go between these 2 chords, just practice this one movement. And I notice, my hands are all screwed up. Of course, this is terrible. And then I slow it down. It becomes manageable, right?
Yeah. So
and when I do chess lessons, it's kind of like that also, because you're trying to go fast, you're just glazing over it. And the object is not during a game, you're going to be a turtle the whole time, right? It's more just, you learn how to do it slowly and methodically and correctly at first, and then it becomes almost automatic to do it that way. Your brain will naturally do it. There's a reason why you watch GMs calculate lines sometimes, and they're very accurate right out of the gate, and it's because they're naturally doing that. They're always considering, not that they're going to do it perfectly, and taking more time will help, but you want it automatically to do that. You don't want it to be you have to force yourself.
And Josh, aside from not thinking widely enough, do any other common intermediate mistakes spring to mind?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of them. One of my favorite ones that I end up harping on a lot is kind of useless artificial moves. So what I would define that is like someone's like, they're like, all right, I played rook a d8. So when you're learning, right, you learn everything good, you put your pieces in the center, everything's great, right? But later you get you can judge whether something's good. There's so many times I'll see, all right, rook a d8 or rook a c8 or rook a c1 and a c4, a d4 opening all the time. But it's like, okay, what does your rook do there?
Right.
I don't know. It's like, it's just not a useful move. Or moves like h6, a6, like prophylactic moves that prevent nothing, that do like almost nothing. I see it a lot. And the fact is that like, and this is another general one that I harp on. I have to practice not venting about it, but it's kind of like time matters. Like you can't take your time in most positions too much. Like chess is a relatively fast-paced game. You have to make your moves count as much as you can, right? So there are situations you can take your time and play slow, but if you're playing like semi-useless moves like pretty early when you could be developing pieces, it's really not good. And it's a mistake I see a lot. Like I see it more than I used to. Like because when I was young, I was kind of a like very aggressive player. Not like I am now, but like I was a very aggressive player who would sack pieces. I always wanted to get things out really fast. So when I see like even younger players now like playing moves like h6 and a6, it freaks me out. But it's something I see a lot though, like where it's like ask if your move like really does something. Um,
It's funny you mentioned that because in our last interview in 2018,
yeah,
that was when you were doing this series on YouTube called Autopsy, which
yeah.
it's still up. I definitely recommend listeners check it out. Very instructive videos from Josh.
Hmm.
And one of the terms you used that stuck with me, I think I might have even mentioned in our other interview, was this idea of housekeeping moves.
Yeah.
So I think it's like a fine line for
It really is. It's not as easy as you would think.
yeah, because it's
Yeah.
like we might think we're being prophylactic, but we're really wasting time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, a lot of it is to do with the like you have to read the game situation, right? Like if you're like a lot of these kind of h6 a6 moves I'm talking about are relatively early when you could be developing pieces or making big improvements. Like look
Yeah.
for big improvements first, and then there are positions where there's not much going on. So then playing little improving moves, but improving, but like small improving moves can be nice because a lot of big moves just don't exist. You don't have big improvements to make, so you make small ones, but you always look for the big ones first. I mean, it's just like if you can put develop a piece first, like it's usually good, right? So,
Yeah. All right.
but
That makes
everything
sense.
is situational for sure.
Yeah. And actually, even in like the teaching I've done of people, 16, 1700,
Yeah,
I've noticed a lot of those H3 type moves.
it
Like
happens all the time. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
It's something that it's especially just because it's so different than like I had loads of weaknesses right when I was younger and all of this, but it was like it's just so different. The notion that like even young players play like that now is like it's just weird to me. Like it's not bad, right? It's a funny weakness to have.
Yeah.
Like when you should be overly ambitious and trying to checkmate when you shouldn't and things like that.
Yeah. It goes back to the adults being more cautious, thing, which I've definitely observed in chess players. So they want to,
Yeah.
prepare everything and then launch.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
chess
Chess
doesn't always work that way.
not life and chess not perfect, right?
Yeah,
You have to
exactly.
you have to get things out sometimes. Yeah, I also wanted to mention you mentioned the autopsy series. So the autopsy series, I mean, I don't want to say I put a knife in it. That's a little bit wrong, but I don't plan on doing anything with that in particular. But I am trying to make my YouTube channel active again. It was something.
Nice.
Well, I talked to Chessable, like social media people and stuff like that, because it's something I'm. If there were ratings, I would be like below zero with that kind of stuff. So they're like, I'm like, what can I do if I don't know anything and I'm not going to do tons of stuff? They're like, well, like YouTube videos are good and stuff like that. I'd recommend that. And for a while, I wasn't doing them because I was doing so many videos and getting, paid to do them, right? That I wasn't
Right.
doing my channel as much. But I'm trying to make my channel active again. So 1 or 2 videos a week, different levels too. So some will be beginner focused, others will be more intermediate to advanced. Some will be like the last one I did one on like Chess960 and how I view like trying to learn from Chess960 and watching Chess960 in
So
your
did you
own
follow
games.
this event that just
Yeah,
happened
yeah.
in Germany?
Yeah.
So raging debates on the internet. I mean,
Uh-oh.
about like how much people like Chess960, whether or not
Yeah.
what role it should play in professional chess. What's your perspective, Josh?
Well, I can tell you that, like, my perspective and a lot of GMs, we love Chess960 because it's cool. Like, it's like we, not that chess isn't good by itself, but we've explored so many opening possibilities and things like that. To be able to explore new positions is really cool. I like that there's classical, because the fact that Chess960 was only rapid, like I played one Chess960 event, it was in Iceland, it was rapid, like, and it's like at least one of those games I lost on time. I did pretty well in the event, but like I lost on time one game. I think it was to Lenderman. We were just laughing at the board.
Right.
Okay. But it was kind of, it was really interesting, but it's like, but I can't figure it out. I have no time. I have to just be practical. And there is an aspect to that, but being able to think and being able to do that, I think it's really cool. I can see though the perspective of, it's hard to follow, even for like, I have to really pay attention to make sure I know where everything is. And I can imagine that for intermediate players, especially, or below, it's going to be just so hard to follow because of how crazy it is. I think that for a spectator sport, it will need some time. I think as an interest, though, it is really interesting. And if you have people who present it well, it can be cool to watch. It's just you would need some good explanations. I don't watch commentary very often.
Right.
Which is, it's not most commentary is not for me, right? So, but it's like, if the commentary is good, I could imagine people following it, but it would be hard by yourself because it's so confusing. I like it as a game though, and I think it's fun to watch. I think they should stop renaming it. Can we decide on a name?
Seriously.
Like, it's getting kind of stupid.
Yeah.
Freestyle. Like, are we going to have butterfly chess next? Like, what is happening?
Right.
But I think they need to decide on a name. But I think it has promise. But it's going to be hard to But I think the fact that it was classical, I really liked. Because I like classical in general, but for 960, I think it's really important that it's classical.
Yeah. I mean, even, Magnus, no fan of classical chess, but for 960, he likes it for those same reasons you mentioned.
I mean, I don't even know if I believe the whole no fan of classical chess thing. It's more like, the World Championship, like preparing for that. I can't even imagine how exhausting that is all the time. Like, I mean, Dingler and taking a year off, I'm like, sure, buddy.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine. Like, for me, it's, and especially now, like, because I would say, like, as a professional player, like, I'm not playing right now, and I'm hoping to come back to it, but it's kind of like playing professionally is like a whole full-time thing where it's just, and you constantly are looking at openings at the top level, right? Like, I don't have to do that, but top players have to do that all the time. And I can imagine how just staring at a computer, like, I could see how that gets annoying, right? But I think, it doesn't mean that classical chess is like, he would hate it necessarily. It's just, there's a lot tied to it, and it is exhausting. That is definitely one thing.
Yeah.
It's a lot
I'm
of
very
energy.
sympathetic to the top players, but I'm also sympathetic to amateurs that are like, chess is confusing enough, when I know where when I know where the pieces start. Like,
I totally get it. It's one of those things where, because I mean, the whole, like, seeing a board, right? Like, I can adapt to a Chess960 position. Okay, it takes me time, but like, if you're 1600 or 50, I can imagine just being like, okay, this is just random. Like, why is this happening? I try to actually, in my video, I try to break it down a little bit and explain, like, I took the Carlsen position where he played G4, for example, and I explained how, well, you just look, right? The G4 pawn can't be attacked by anything. The knight on H1 is bad. It comes behind the pawn. It actually is very logical here. Let's take the chess position. This is why it doesn't work here. It doesn't serve a function. It gets attacked by the bishop, right? I apologize to all the Grob fans out there,
Right.
but you know what I mean? Like, so I try to break that down, and I think if it's broken down, people can follow it. But I think actually that the fact that it's classical is really important, because like, no matter how great a commentator you are, if you're breaking down a rapid Chess960 game, good luck to you.
Yeah. And it sounds like, I mean, the guy who sponsored this is going to sponsor a bunch more of them, so we'll have time to decide if we're going to like it or not. Yeah, and by the way, Josh, I strongly agree with you about the name. It's it just adds another layer of confusion. But
and then like freestyle go, like what is happening? Like, I don't know.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well, bringing it back to regular chess improvement, which is challenging enough,
Yeah.
we have a question from Patreon sub and your friend and fellow Wisconsinite, Chris Wainscott. Chris,
How's it going, Chris?
thanks as always for supporting the pod. So, Chris, first of all, thanks you for giving him a grill. So apparently your generosity knows no bounds, Josh.
Yeah. It was that was the best. Like, I taught him chess for a while. He still actually attended like one of my monthly training sessions that I run. But the grill was the greatest gift I could ever give. So.
Yeah, and we may talk some cooking at the end, but we'll save that for we'll save that for the end. So Chris asks, he says, how should players approach goal setting? The goal can be whatever you like: rating, learning, and opening. Can you give some examples of goals you've set for yourself?
Yeah. So I'm not as much a goal-oriented person, if that makes sense. So when I was younger and trying to get to different levels, right? Obviously, it's like, well, the next level's national master. I guess I'll shoot for that. FM, IM, GM, right? Well, where do I go now? I'm not going to become world champion probably, but I'll try to get to this, right? But it wasn't really what motivated me. I was always just kind of learning. But I would say that goals help a lot of people, like very specific goals. So I can appreciate that. The one advice I would give with goal setting is make it something that is as much within your control as possible. So I don't like rating goals because let's say you're 2100 trying to get to 2200. And you're like, okay, I'm going to study. I'm going to do all this great stuff. Great. I'm going to play a tournament. Now, in this tournament, you play 3 juniors who are underrated by 300 points. And then you play a retired person and you walk into their prep and you happen to lose. And then you take a bath, right? Okay, well, I guess what you were doing, the studying you didn't work. You have to change. But that's not necessarily true, right?
Right.
That wasn't in your control fully. Like when you're dealing with opponents, right? You can't just, count on it on getting to a certain place. So rating goals, I think, are not as ideal because of that. Like if you set a rating goal, at least make it long term, like a very long term goal, because the fact is that like it's not within your control always. It really just isn't. So I like goals that are firmly within your control. So for example, my goal is for the next month, I'm going to get in, and I'm going to average this many study hours per week. I'm going to learn this opening. I'm going to do this. These are goals that you can control, right? As much as possible. Obviously, things can come up, right? But if you set goals that you can control, then, it's really up to you whether you make them. I think that that's the best. And make your goals kind of work and output oriented. If you have a goal, for example, like a lot of people are time troublers, right? And they get into time trouble every game. All right, in my next tournament, I'm going to get in time trouble less than half the games. That's my goal. Those are goals you have more control over. But when it's rating goals, it's not just up to you, which means that you could get negative feedback for doing good things, right? If you lose 20 points in a tournament, but you studied really hard and did as much as you could to maximize that tournament, you don't want to have negative feedback. You want that to be, you did things correctly. You have to keep at doing that, and eventually you will do better, right? So.
Yeah, excellent advice. And so you said you're not a goal-oriented person. Like,
no, I'm not saying it's a positive thing either. It's just I'm kind of a learner, I guess, if that makes sense. Like even with, whether it's, guitar or tennis or cooking, any of my interests, right? Like it's like, all right, I want to learn how to perfect biryani or something, right? It's like I'll keep working at it and I'll have a goal in mind of, all right, I want it to taste kind of like this and want it to go here, but the exploration of it and figuring things out and figuring out, so you have to let this cook in the pan for a little longer and you have to add water to it here. That's it. Like those kind of things, right? I find interesting, like the exploration of a subject. So that's mostly what I'm in it for. I love exploring my interest and exploring chess and positions and things like that. And I just have never been motivated particularly by a goal as much. In chess, I did just because they were there, right? Like, GM, that sounds like a cool thing to pursue, right? But mostly I'm just learning, right? And trying to perform better and playing,
And you mentioned, Josh, like, at some point we all figure out, except for, Magnus and Ding Loren and whoever, that we're not going to be world champion. But obviously you were quite an accomplished player as a youth. Do you remember a moment where you sort of had to reckon with your own chess mortality, even though it's at a high level? It's
not really. Like in that, the fact is that I always was kind of, I grew up the same generation as Hikaru, right? He's a year younger than me. And it's like, if I'm watching someone like that, it's like if I'm always thinking, oh, I have to be, like that good or whatever, it's going to be hard, right? Like I have to do my own thing and see how good I can become, right? And, there was a point where the reason I stopped, I took a break for a couple years, and then COVID happened, and then personal life got in the way and whatever. I didn't intend to take a break for as long as I have. But initially it was just, I wasn't enjoying it that much. It wasn't my results. My rating was actually going up. I think I was like 25, 50 something again, and I was going up. My rating, I was doing fine. I even won a tournament relatively recently, but it was like, I didn't really, it was round 2 of a tournament, and I was like, man, this is exhausting. Kind of like I get the Carlsen thing. And it was like, it's just, I realized I'd been doing it professionally for just a long time, and that's all I was doing. And I didn't, I did admit that, like, I'm not good enough to make just a living at playing. I'm really not.
Right.
And I would need to become much better. Like, it's not even, if I gain 100 points, if I get 100 points stronger, I still might not be good enough to make a living from just playing. So if I'm going to play, I need to enjoy it. Like, to me, that's a necessity. And, for me, that's what I accepted more than just not being good enough. Like, I never was thinking that way. Like, sure, I would like to become a stronger player. Like, I accept there are stronger players, more talented players. Most of the people in my rank, sure, more talented, whatever. But it didn't really matter to me. I just didn't enjoy it. And that's what I cared about.
And so how concrete is this plan of coming back? And I'm curious, like,
at the moment, it's kind of like, it's one of those where, because it's been like a lot longer than I planned for various reasons that were not in my control, let's say, like it's one of those things where I want to do it in the really right way. So I care about that more. Like, I want to enjoy when I come back, and I also want to be ready. Like, I don't want to come back and, I mean, it's already, people are stronger, right? Like, I don't care about gaining or losing rating, but I don't want to come back and just feel like can't play or whatever. So, it's going to involve, all right, I'm going to have an event I really want to play in. I'm not going to just play some random thing where it's like 2 games a day. And I'm just like, okay, I want it to be something I really want to play in. I want it to be like, I'm really well prepared, like tons of training games. I have people I play with and stuff like that, right? And train with. So lots of training games. My openings, half of them are outdated. I still, because I teach, and I still teach strong players a lot, like I still have to know openings, but to have my own stuff really well prepared again, to, refresh all, like, it's going to be a lot of work. And it's kind of like, I have to be in a position in life where I'm ready to do that.
Yeah.
And so I would say it's not concrete yet, but it's swinging towards that way. Like, things are, it's looking like I'm going to be able to do that. So I'm really looking forward to it, but I also really want it to be like, I'm really ready to play, and it's an event I want to play at, and things like that.
Do you have a sense of what event that might be, or?
Not yet. It's one of those, like, there are certain tournaments I've enjoyed playing. Things like Reykjavik Open, I really, events like that I've always enjoyed, like where it's a cool location and you go, it's different, right? And it's mostly, I think it was 1 game day with 2 games in a day for whatever reason. But it's like, mostly it's kind of nice and things like that. So it might be like an out of the country tournament, but there's some organizers here who I've enjoyed like playing their events as well. But it's one of those where it would have to be like, like somewhere I really want to be playing and doing it. And again, if I don't do great, that's okay. Like, I'm not expected to come back and crush everyone, right? But it's like, I have a standard, and I want to at least, be able to enjoy it and be able to do well. So.
Sounds reasonable, and I think it's relatable for, non-grandmasters like myself as well. All right, we have another Patreon mailbag question. Mm-hmm. This one is from Brian Karen of the Facebook Chessbook Collectors Group.
Yep.
And Brian asks, he says, you had the opportunity to work with a wide variety of excellent coaches, which, according to the internet, Josh, those coaches are Christiansen, Kaidanov, and Goldin. We'll verify that in a second. But Brian asks, can you detail what was most memorable about each of your coaches?
Yeah. So first of all, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my first coach, which was National Master Hal Terrie from New Hampshire. Being from New Hampshire, there was not a lot of chess there. You look at the number of rated players from that state, not a lot. So I didn't have a ton of choice, but, I happened to get introduced to Hal through a mutual friend, I think. And, I was very young, but he taught me from when I was, 6 years old, basically, until I became 2300, until I became higher rated than him. So he was someone who I worked with a ton. And a lot of the things, he was a kind of coach who I don't know. He was very dry, kind of. I don't know if he would have worked for everyone, but he had kind of a cool sense of humor, which I like. I assume he still does. I haven't talked to him in a long time. But he had like kind of a cool sense, a very dry sense of humor, but he was very big on, like, he loved endgames. So I developed my love of endgames kind of through him as well, because I really like that phase of the game. And he also had me playing all the gambits and crazy stuff that I did. Even though he was a dry positional player, I was playing, my first openings were like Schliemann and Benko and every kind of Scotch gambit. Basically, there's a good chance on move 6 I was down upon.
Right.
Just, and, obviously my openings changed and my style changed, but it did, give me, I think, a feel for the initiative younger and things like that. So that was a lot of what I remembered. And, again, like a really great coach for me for a long time. So he helped me a lot. I wanted to mention that. I did mostly phone lessons with after that, which didn't work as well just because the phone, and I was young, and it had nothing to do with his English, which was completely fine, but I had trouble understanding because the phone, and I was, so I didn't take lessons with him, private lessons, too long. I did do a couple like US chess schools with him and stuff. And what I mostly got from him was that I really appreciated how professional he was. Like when he went to a tournament, no matter how he was feeling, no matter what was going on, I'd seen him have, bad for last run, things like that. Like he always was basically, every single game, I'm going to put the maximum. And, it doesn't matter if I'm not feeling it or whatever. Like he had a very professional approach, which I got to appreciate. And I try to do the same when I go to events. I don't care how I'm feeling. Like even that event I mentioned, that it was like Washington International, a really nice event. I liked that event. And it was round 2 and I was tired, but I played the whole event. I even did okay, even though I wasn't feeling it at all. And I think a lot of that is watching someone like him.
Yeah.
So I got that a lot from him. After that, I worked with Larry Christiansen in Massachusetts. So it was a very interesting switch because he was very different from Kaidanov in that Kaidanov seemed like very organized to me. You could tell he prepared for the lessons, and he was like, just the way he thought was very organized and stuff like this. Larry was not like that at all. But what I got from him was just, it was so fun to look at positions with him. He just had ideas all the time. Every position, he'd be like, yeah, so you do this. And like it was also hard. Like he calculated, and probably still does, like so fast. So to keep up with him, I would have to work. So after 2 hours of working with him, I would be, I'd feel it, and it was like a really cool challenge. And also he got me, it's funny, like, even though he's a very aggressive player, it's his reputation, he actually has a lot of solidity to how he thinks. In a lot of positions, he got me to think more positionally, actually. I still remember there was one example I was showing him one of the games, and I was young. I was trying to show him games I was proud of, So I had a game where I had kind of a cool positional win, and there was a position where I grabbed an exchange, right? And he was like, and I was like, with a tactic, I was very proud of myself, And he was kind of like, yeah, but you could just play this move and have this opposite bishop endgame and just win without effort. Like, why are you sacking exchange? Right. And that struck me. I was like, oh, I can just play the position like a normal person and just win. Like, I don't have to do this exchange sack, which makes the game much more complicated. Or not exchange sack, like grab the exchange. It makes the game more tricky. And I remember moments like that with him, as well as just like the number of ideas. And, a lot of lessons would be, he'd have some cool opening idea, and we just look at that for like half an hour instead of whatever else. But it was like, it made you want to look at chess. It made me kind of, inspired to look at chess myself. So that was a big part of what I remember with him. And then with Alex Goldin, he was like very positionally minded as a player. So a lot of positional stuff, because I would say I was a tactical player for a very long time, an attacking player. And he really helped me with positional chess a lot, as well as with classical stuff. Like he's someone who is, Soviet trained, like very knows like, everything you can know about a Carlsbad structure, things like that. So a lot of that kind of training I got from him, as well as just a lot of cool moments. I remember one where this position, I remember I was black against Ibragimov, who I tended to always get taught a lesson by, which was always fun. But, I had this position where it was really tricky. I thought I didn't like my position. I wasn't sure what to do. And Goldin was like, oh, yeah, just play like, your knight's on e4. It doesn't do anything now. Put it back on f6. Just play a move in the center. That's good. And I was like, oh. And, he was someone who always had a lot of energy and was always kind of fun to look at chess with. And, he's someone who I actually helped one time prepare for the US senior, which was a funny moment. But he's someone who I worked with a lot, who I enjoyed working with as well. So I was very lucky to have the coaches I had. I'm very thankful I was able to do that.
Yeah, legends. And is there anyone that wasn't listed on your Wikipedia page that you've worked with?
I've worked with people like in like smaller capacities, I guess. Like I remember, like I've worked with Yermo for like a very brief period. It was myself, actually, and Danny Rich. I remember it was after like a event in Arizona, and it was him and I were working with Yermo on endgames, and that was kind of fun. I really enjoyed that. And then, I remember when I lived in California, we had the whole chess house phenomenon.
Right.
And where I didn't live, but I lived nearby. So they had a couple people come, and they had Sakis, Lev Sakis was there. So, we worked with him for a week, and then
yeah, because I've heard Naroditsky
well.
discuss. We're obviously younger than you, but Bay Area, and I've heard him discuss working with Sakis, but he lived in Israel, right?
Yeah, he lived in Israel. He came over, like he was in the U.S. doing some things. I think he worked with Danya as well, who was in San Francisco at the time. So he came by to do a couple things, but he worked with us for like a week or so, and it was because I think it was when Vinay had the Sanford, and that was one of the investment things he did.
Okay.
And then and Mikhailevsky came as well. Victor, really nice guy, a friend of mine, who I enjoyed working with. Two completely different approaches and people, even though they're both kind of from Israel, I guess. But
right.
But yeah, and that was kind of cool. But it was smaller capacities, right? A little bit there, a week here, 2 days there. So those are the main people I worked with. I would say were Hal, Larry, and Alex Goldin.
Okay.
And with Kaidanov, like for like a briefer period.
Okay. And just as a brief explainer on the chess house, so for listeners,
yeah.
Josh, we talked about this in our 2018 interview. Josh lived nearby. This is the somewhat infamous house with Jesse Krive and I bought David Bruce. I've interviewed all of them, so you can hear the discussions from different perspectives. And Shanklin eventually too, right?
Yeah, Shanklin kind of when Vinay moved out, Shanklin moved in. It was a whole thing.
Amazing,
but
strong
and
house.
Thankfully, I didn't live there, which probably spared me a lot. But I, was living across the street essentially, so I worked with them. I'd come over in the morning, and work on chess and stuff like that. It was still fun memories of that whole thing. I miss that from time to time, having because I still work with, I have a couple of people I work with online and stuff like that, but it's different than just being able to have a chessboard there and work with people. I still really enjoy that.
Yeah, and I'm guessing you're the strongest player in Wisconsin.
No, I can't even claim that. There's a Wonder is from Wisconsin.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
You've got good company at least. So
do yeah. Well, I always I worked with him sometimes.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask.
A couple times more recently, and then but he was a lot younger as well, and and it's kind of like even when he was even more recently, he was already stronger than me, but it was kind of like there were definite things I could work with him with and things like that. But a lot of it also was like me trying to teach him something and him like brutally punishing me. It's like, all right. But yeah, I really like a really nice kid, and really
he seems like
not a kid anymore, but yeah, like really incredibly talented. If he chooses to do more chess, like he would be really, but he has other things going. Like, we'll see where he goes. But
is he still at U of Chicago? Like the years kind of blend together.
I don't know. I haven't talked to him in a really. Occasionally, I'll like be like, hey, that game you just played is really cool, but I haven't really talked to him in a while. So
okay. Cool. All right. Well, Josh, last major topic. Yep. We got to get to your off the board interests. I mean, we've talked some guitar already, but in our last conversation, we talked tennis and cooking. How are your elos in those activities?
Well, in tennis, I recently moved up to 4 or 5 from 4.0, and I would say like I probably like it was a little overdue in that like other years I should have moved up, but the way USTA works is kind of weird. So, but I'd say like at the moment I'm like I went from being like very strong 4.0 to now I'm like I like in doubles, I'm probably like low to mid 4 or 5 level, and in singles a little bit worse, I guess.
And what would be the chess rating?
But I compete with like 4 or 5s in singles too. Like, okay, like I'm not as good at singles, but
what would be the chess rating equivalence?
I don't know. Like, I talk to people and like numbers like you could say I maybe just crossed 2,000 or something. I don't know.
Okay.
Some number like that. Like to give you an idea, I think like in the Milwaukee area, tennis has a lot more players probably than chess, right? But in the Milwaukee area, there are like, 100, 150, some number like that ranked higher than me, something like this.
Okay.
I don't know. So basically, I'm not going pro anytime soon, but I'm enjoying it and trying to still get better.
And what other title players? I think I got a breakdown from Mike Klein at some point, but who else? I know Eric Rosen plays tennis. I heard
Eric
Ray
Rosen,
Robson is
Ray
good.
Robson. I mean, Mark Esselman's probably the best. He used to be. He played like a futures event. Like he was like serious player. I got to hit with him a few times. Like really, really good. And I've heard some other people are good, but I've never played with them or anything like that. I think Evan Ju, someone like that, played college, but But basically, I'm at the level where I'm like really good as like an amateur, but I play anyone who's like remotely professional, and it's like very sad. So I'm at that level.
And what about cooking? How's your cooking game?
Cooking is going okay. Like it's kind of different because like when you it depends like where you are and who you're cooking for and things like that. So I would say my cooking game's doing okay. I'd say I cooked a lot more Indian food recently. So I went from making not great biryani, for example, to making much, much better. Sag's always been a favorite of mine. That's gotten better, things like that. So I make a lot of, more Indian food and Thai and Chinese food and stuff like that than I used to, and less Mediterranean-ness, I guess. But I still like, I love making a roast chicken, things like that. I can still do it, but it's not something I do as often.
You're making me hungry. All right. And last topic, Josh, before we started recording, you were starting to tell me about a book that you're working on. So I don't know how much you want to reveal, but
I'm not a particularly secretive person, but basically, yeah. So, I mean, I'm working on something. It's some, it's one of those things where, hey, any publishers watching, you definitely shoot me an email or something, but I want to have a little bit more together. So I have a lot of words in it, but I need more like just examples, and some of them I'm creating, just positions I'm creating because it works better for the example, and others I need to find or take from my collection of positions. But the basic idea is kind of like I was talking about how like for beginners, if you try to like say you're teaching, like I was teaching like my niece like a bunch of years ago, right? You don't start with a board full of pieces. It's kind of ridiculous, right? You start with one piece. This is how it moves. You put it in the center of the board, try to move it, try to do things, right? So I take a lot of chess topics and I basically do that. So let's take calculation as an example. The first thing I start with, only what is a tempo move? Only tempo moves, right? Like forcing moves, captures, checks, threats, right? I want you to spot every tempo move just for you. Okay, next set, just for your opponent. It's kind of the sort of tedious playing scales, say, type work that no one really wants to do. Right. But like that's how you build up a skill. So I basically build it from almost nothing to, like the very beginning and to more advanced, like how to calculate when it's a bit more complicated. It's intended for like intermediate players largely, but it goes to more like slightly more advanced, and it starts. I do have a beginner section.
Okay.
Where I talk about a lot of things I like to do as a beginner. And so I have a beginner section, but then it's like, and the same thing with endgames. Like with endgames, I break them down into actually different categories, and I talk about how to learn different categories of endgames. And again, starting from most basic.
What would be an example category?
So one category, for example, are endgames. Your goal is to know them and be able to play them in your sleep and know precisely what it is right away without thinking.
So like technical, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't group it technical and practical because those terms get thrown around a lot, in my opinion, incorrectly. Mm-hmm. I call them very creatively type 1 through 4.
Okay.
But the basic idea is type 1 is like you do it like someone wakes you up at 3 a.m., puts a position in front of you. You can play it perfectly every time against a computer, basically. That's the goal. It doesn't mean you're there right away. But like, for example, things from king and pawn endgames to Philidor. And, that's the first type. And my main thing that I'm trying to get across is that a big goal of learning endgames is to expand that as much as possible. So your type 1 endgames become bigger. Like the more endgames you can play, because at first it takes a while to be able to defend a Philidor without thinking. Eventually you can kind of do it. Like without thinking almost at all. You can just defend a Philidor, but that's your goal, to know them that well. Then there are endgames like you calculate to get to that position, right? So you calculate a force line to get there. Then there are ones which are, I would call them like simple endgames is what I call them, but you could call them technical endgames, where it's basically like a rook and pawn, like endgames where there are not a lot of threats, like there's not a lot going on, and then it's about the importance of planning. But the eventual goal is usually all endgames end up in type 1 eventually. So the idea is you expand type 1. I kind of tell you how to do that and how to figure them out, and then talk about how to approach different types of endgames and learn them. And I'll do the same again. I'm trying to do the same with openings, different middle game stuff. It turned out from a book where I was originally going to do kind of tips for players to this outrageous thing, however that happened. But I'm hoping, though, it's like going to be fairly comprehensive.
Sounds great.
I just hope I don't bore people to tears. That's my main goal.
It's always a good goal, yeah.
yeah. Like I'm trying to make it more like the language a bit casual, just so it's like it doesn't seem like you're reading a technical, notebook, but it will have a lot more technical things in it that kind of the stuff that you should do at first, but that a lot of people probably don't have.
Okay, excellent. Sounds good. Well, hopefully we can discuss it when it sees the light of day. Which
I'm really hoping it gets to the point where I have more free time and like it can, see the light of day. But I'm getting there. Like it's a work in progress for sure.
Excellent. All right. Well, Josh, it was good to catch up. For listeners, the course is called Beginner Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. But yeah, I'm excited to hear that you'll be posting more on YouTube and stuff, because as I've told you many times, I'm always enjoy your instructional content. So congrats on the course, and
appreciate
good luck with the book.
Thanks
and the cooking and the tennis and the guitar and everything else.
You can see why I didn't become stronger at chess, right? Like I have way too much else going on.
Yeah, that's rule number one is don't have any other interests.
Yeah.
All right, Josh. Thanks a lot.
See you.